Good afternoon. I hope you've had some good workshops. I know I went to two fantastic workshops, so I hope the rest of you had the same experience. I'm Anno Saxenian. I'm Dean of the School of Information. This is the second annual DataEDGE conference, and we're really delighted to have all of you here. And we're especially pleased to have our speaker tonight, our keynoter tonight, Kate Crawford. Kate is a principal researcher at Microsoft Research in their social media collective. She works there with several of our wonderful alums. Some of us have a hard time keeping one job, going with the one job, but she has a lot of jobs. She's also a visiting professor at the MIT Center for Civic Media, a senior fellow at the Information Law Institute at NYU, and an associate professor at the University of New South Wales. She has energy. Kate's research examines how people engage with network technologies and the political, cultural, social, philosophical, and policymaking implications. I think she wants to understand how network data becomes part of our understanding of what is knowledge, privacy issues, democracy, intimacy, subjectivity, some big issues. She has done interview-based research in small towns as well as very big cities in Australia, in the US, and in India. Her first book, which has a great title, Adult Themes, was published with Macmillan. For those of you that are curious, its subtitle was Rewriting the Rules of Adulthood, and it's about how adulthood is changing, thankfully, in this era. Today, Kate is going to speak to us about the raw and the cooked mythologies of big data. Please join me in welcoming Kate Crawford.
Well, hi, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. I think particularly so because of the sorts of diverse people that are brought together to this conference by the Berkeley iSchool. As a critical social scientist, I have the luck and the privilege of getting to have conversations and collaborations with people completely outside of my discipline. So I work with people in computer science, in machine learning and information retrieval, as well as anthropologists and people who are STS scholars. And I think part of the reason I find big data so interesting is because we can all bring our perspectives to the table. It is one of those areas that is burgeoning and I think is in dire need of different sorts of insights. But one of the things that tends to bother me is the emergence of what I've called big data fundamentalism, which is the belief that somehow correlation is just as good as causation, more or less, and that with massive data sets and predictive analytics, we somehow get closer to elusive truth and objectivity. So I'm going to start with one of the quotes that is pretty much one of my all-time favorites about data, and I'm sure it's going to be very familiar to many of you in the room. It's Jeff Bowker from 2005 when he writes that raw data is both an oxymoron and a bad idea. On the contrary, data should be cooked with care. And what I really like about this is that it forces us to move against that almost habitual belief that when we're working with data, it's something that just exists outside of us, that we can mine from databases and from customer records as though we were pulling oil or mineral resources out of the ground. On the contrary, data is something that we have to imagine. We have to be able to recognize it, first of all, as data. And in doing that, it is this act of insight, of creativity, and where we're actually really molding data as the creators and cooks of data. So that is something that requires an enormous amount of care and an enormous amount of forethought. And the reason why, I think, is because data is such a powerful agent in terms of how we understand our society, in terms of how we understand governance, and I think that requires a particular kind of caution in terms of what a data set actually represents, in terms of what is being left out of that data set, and in essence, what are the ethics of using it. Of course, I think Bowker's words trace us back many years prior to the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, who was, in fact, quite a dapper man in his youth. So I had to go for this photo rather than his rather, old and dignified shots. But he wrote a fabulous book called The Raw and the Cooked, which was the first book in a series of 4, which became a masterpiece of cultural anthropology called Mythologies. And what he did is very long-term field work with a set of tribes around the world, but specifically Amero-Indian tribes. And he was collecting their myths because he thought myths were important in terms of understanding the stories that societies tell about themselves. And he found particular kinds of binaries in those stories, like the raw and the cooked, as being incredibly consistent binaries. He ended up collecting 167 myths. So because I know that I'm standing in the way between you and cocktails, I won't try to come up with 167, I promise. But I am going to give you 6 myths about big data that I think are really useful to think through, because we are at a stage where these myths are still operative, we're using them every day, but there are some dangers in these myths if they crystallize into orthodoxies. Also, I think it's an ideal historical moment for us to be having cross-sector, cross-industry, and cross-discipline conversations about data, recognizing that we're all particular kinds of cooks, that we're out there hunting and gathering data, we're cleaning it, we're preparing it, and then ultimately we're serving it up for other people to consume. So first of all, what is this thing called big data? Well, as we know, it's so profoundly overhyped and it's been used in so many different places and spaces that it's very difficult to know exactly what people mean when they say it. I'm going to go back to a very basic working definition that Dana Boyd and I came up with in an early paper on big data in 2011, where we described it as being essentially a technological, cultural, and scholarly phenomenon that had 3 interrelated elements. The first is technology, which is the way that we maximize computational power and algorithmic accuracy. The second is analysis, which is thinking about essentially the kinds of tools that we use to gather and compare data. So we could talk about things like MapReduce or Hadoop in this kinds of contexts. And finally, mythology, the belief that somehow with big data sets, we will generate results with greater truth, accuracy, and objectivity. Now, in many ways, I think big data is an extremely powerful way for us as data scientists to understand the world. And in some ways, it could be a shift at the level of knowledge, so what philosophers would call an epistemological shift as much as a technological or a methodological one. But this is why I also tend to think that it's really important to start asking about these questions and stories, essentially, that we're telling about big data to figure out where they might be leading us astray. The first myth I want to talk about today is that big data is new. And again, given the amount of coverage this year alone, you would be completely forgiven for thinking that it's something we pretty much just figured out. But in actual fact, big data and the idea of big data has been around for a lot longer than you might think. I actually did a bit of digging through the archives to try and figure out when people started using this term for the first time in the scientific literature. So according to the ACM Digital Library, the first record of the term big data is from 1997. And it was specifically talking about the difficulties in visualizing big data. And we see it again in 1999 when Byers and a group of other scholars wrote quite a fantastic article about trying to deal with the difficulty of big data where we tend to focus on the numbers and not on the insight. And I think a lot of the wisdoms of this paper are actually still relevant today. But we can even go further back. Much further back, I think, than the 1990s, in what I would call essentially the prehistory of big data. By this, I mean looking to the industries that have been dealing with large data sets and the problems of analytics for many decades. So it could be the financial industry, who've been dealing with algorithms and data for a very long time. We could be talking about the oil industry, which has had the resources and the computational power and a lot of incentive to actually do large big data analyses of the Earth. And of course, the NSA, who've been gathering enormous amounts of data and trying to figure out what to do with it. And even climate data. So here I'm thinking of Paul Edwards' stunning book, A Vast Machine, where he looks at the way that data began to be imagined, particularly around the 1950s and 60s, and what the challenges of big data were then for climate. So given these industrial prehistories, I think we can see that big data isn't new, so much as reaching a point where these tools and technologies are reaching a lot more people. So that's why people like us can get our hands on it. So this is actually producing a whole variety of new questions about big data. Lisa Gittleman has this fantastic story. She's a historian based at NYU. And she talks about why mathematical physics had this explosion at Cambridge University in the late 18th century. And it was because they introduced written exams. So suddenly, the tools of pen and paper allowed people to think more abstractly and come up with things that they simply couldn't do in an oral exam context. And I think in a similar way, the fact that a lot of the tools of big data are becoming more easily reached by a lot more people, we're having this explosion of ideas, creativity, and imagination in terms of what we can do with these technologies. But this means that big data now is not one epistemology. It's not one industry. It's actually a whole lot of different ways of everyday practices of doing big data in a whole lot of different spaces. And in this sense, I think the focus on the newness and what's so exciting about big data kind of reminds me of the way we were hearing about the mobile phone in the 1990s as this incredibly daring technology that was going to change everything. And then it disappears into the background, and we just use it all the time, and we don't think about it as being something profoundly disruptive. I think something similar is going to happen to big data. And this is, again, something that Lee Starr has written about, that essentially really good technologies, really usable systems, disappear by definition. The easier they are to use, the harder they are to see. So we've got this brief moment where I think big data is very visible, we're thinking about it, we're interested in it, and we can ask some really difficult questions that might be harder for us in 10, 15 years' time, where a lot of these systems are much less visible. So I think this is when we start talking about the upsides and the risks. So the second myth, that big data is objective. I'm going to tell you a story. And this story starts in October last year when I was living in New York and getting a little bit concerned because I was watching this gigantic hurricane make its way over to the East Coast, which ended up being Hurricane Sandy. And as somebody who's done a lot of research on crisis communications, I was kind of fascinated to see how a big city like New York was going to deal with this. And as it happened, I got to see this up close and personal because I happened to be living in Zone A, which is also known as the compulsory evacuation zone. So what happened as the water started flooding down my street and the power went out in my building and the water stopped running and people started knocking on my door and telling me that I had to leave, I became a member of the latest neighborhood in Manhattan, known as, to many of you, South of Power. And what was interesting about living in South of Power, of course, is that I couldn't do things like charge my phone, charge my laptop, do the sorts of things I would normally do in terms of gathering large amounts of Twitter data and immediately analysing it. But fortunately, a lot of people and a lot of friends and collaborators were doing this for me while I was completely off the grid. And what they got was around 20 million tweets that were sent about Hurricane Sandy in a period of 4 days. And those tweets are amazing. It's like a fascinating set of experiences of this particular hurricane. And some really interesting studies are going to be coming out about it as well. There's one which hasn't been published yet by Social Flow, which brings together Twitter data with Foursquare data to tell us some things that you might expect. For example, that grocery shopping spikes the day before a hurricane. But what you might not know is that nightlife spikes the day after a hurricane, presumably when people are so sick of being trapped with their friends and loved ones that they just have to get out. Or alternatively, it's probably the only place where they can find a cold beer. But it would be a real mistake for us to look at a graph like this and to assume that this is pretty much a fair account of what everyone was experiencing during Sandy. Because if we look a little closer at the tweets that were being gathered, the vast majority come from Manhattan. And this makes sense. It's got a higher concentration of people with smartphones, a higher concentration of people using Twitter. But what this is a subset of a subset. 16% of Americans use Twitter. A much, much smaller percentage use Foursquare. And very few tweets were coming from the far more severely affected areas, places like Breezy Point, Coney Island, the Rockaways. So because we don't have the data from those places, the stories that we can tell from the social media are essentially very privileged urban stories. Now, there's still a lot of fascinating stuff in there, but we have to be really clear about who we're talking about when we say what this data set represents. This also means that sometimes it's really important, and I say this as somebody who does a lot of ethnographic work, to actually get out into affected communities and see what's happening, particularly because lots of people just may not be using social media or smartphones, or they simply don't have the power to do so. The other reason that I think this is really important is because we have to think about what this data really represents. So this was the first year when non-human traffic overtook human traffic on the web. And this is actually a very significant moment for many of us who are interested in non-humans, because we now know that essentially search engines, as well as scrapers, as well as malware and spyware, is now doing a lot of work out there that we may not necessarily be detecting or thinking about. The other thing that's really interesting is a study that's shown that there's probably around 30 million fake Twitter accounts. So that's bots or cyborg accounts, which are human-assisted bot accounts. And I know people like Stuart Geddes, who's in the room today, is doing work to thinking about how these bots function. Why aren't we thinking about these bots as particular kinds of communities, rather than just assuming that they're just people who are, expressing emotions and ideas, on the internet? In actual fact, it's really interesting because a study came out last year indicating that, according to Twitter, Thursday night is the saddest night. People are saddest on Thursday nights. And we could raise a whole lot of questions here about sentiment analysis and exactly how accurate it is and what it really reflects. But perhaps another question we could start asking is, what about the bots? Shouldn't we be feeling sorry for bots on Thursday nights? Because they're contributing an enormous amount of data and they're really not very happy about it. So these are the sorts of questions, these are the kind of granular questions that I think you can ask when you spend time studying these data sets, but also studying the communities and spending time with people, particularly in crisis-affected areas.
Do you believe that data is objective?
I'm sorry?
Do you believe that data that we are citing is objective?
I think it's indicative. We could have a very interesting question about whether it's objective. We could certainly say it's indicative of a shift that's happening, and that's why I think it's really interesting. The other thing that I think it's interesting is this question that big data doesn't discriminate. That essentially, because you're dealing with large data sets, you can somehow at this mass level avoid group level prejudice. Yet, of course, big data is being used exactly for this purpose. That big data is neither colourblind nor gender-blind, and particularly in its uses in marketing, we can see how it's being used to put people in ever more precise categories. So many of you would be familiar with a recent study that came out of Cambridge that studied the likes of 60,000 people. And on average, these people had between 150 to 200 likes each. So they used all this data to produce a model where they could predict sensitive information about these people, including sexual orientation, ethnicity, religious views, and even whether they were a previous drug and alcohol user. In fact, it was at its most precise when it was trying to predict whether people were Caucasian or African American. They had around 95% accuracy there. The second most accurate category was male sexuality. Female sexuality, apparently a lot harder to predict, which is very interesting. And then, of course, political leanings. And the researchers, when they released this report, also expressed a set of concerns about the fact that this data can be bought by anyone. So ultimately, employers, government agencies, and landlords can get this data very simply and use it to make particular kinds of decisions about individuals. Another example that is quite significant is thinking about the potential for big data to be used essentially for price discrimination and particular kinds of civil rights related issues. So redlining is a term that was used initially in thinking about the ways in which banks refused to invest in areas that had high African American populations. And this became something that was legislated against. But now researchers are concerned that many big data techniques can simply route around those kinds of regulations, because ultimately what you can do very simply is decide what kind of people are going to receive your particular offers. So let's say, for example, you're trying to sell a particular kind of credit opportunity. Say it's a particular kind of credit card. And you're choosing only the most attractive customers, people with the highest possible incomes. That means that people who don't fall into that category, who may really need that credit offer, simply won't be able to see it or access it. And this is why Scientific American earlier this year raised concerns about the fact that the rich might ultimately be seeing a very different internet to the poor. And I think the difficulty here isn't that big data discriminates. It does. We know it does. This is part of what actually makes it effective in a lot of different spaces. But it's that you can't know if you've been discriminated against. So essentially what that means is that you won't know if you didn't get a job because somebody looked at the data and said, oh, that person is likely to be a drug user, even if you may or may not be, or you didn't essentially get that loan because somebody looked at your search history and it indicated that you're probably not a very good candidate. So the fourth myth I want to talk about, everyone knows this one. Big data makes cities smart. And to be fair, I actually think big data can do an enormous amount to help us reflect on what we're doing in cities and how to do things better and more efficiently. But it can only take us so far. And this is basically because not all data is created or collected equally. So there are always going to be certain people and communities that are left out of those data sets. And I think that ultimately means that big data is only as good as the city officials who are using that data and analysing it and thinking about its limits. So let me give you an example. Boston has a pothole problem. And what they did was actually quite clever. The City of Boston released an app called Street Bump. This was last year. And what Street Bump does, has anyone used Street Bump? No, okay, excellent, on the West Coast. So what it does is it effectively passively collects GPS and accelerometer data as you're driving. So as a Boston resident, what that means is that I can drive along with my phone, essentially reporting back to the city every time I hit a pothole. So it's actually very clever. And they get an enormous amount of data which they can use to then say, well, clearly X thousand number of cars have hit this same bump. It's probably a pothole. Let's go and get it fixed. It's a very good idea. So where's the problem? Well, the problem is if we use apps like this to determine how we fix our roads, we end up getting a map that looks a little bit like this. This is household median income in Boston. And you can see that there are some concentrations of wealth and concentrations of area that are not so wealthy. And what we also know is that wealth tracks very closely against smartphone ownership. So in actual fact, we know that wealthier, younger citizens are more likely to have smartphones. But if we look at older residents, in fact, it gets down to as low as 16% smartphone penetration in Boston. So what this might mean is that if we used maps like this to fix our roads, then the wealthy areas with younger people would get more attention, and the areas with older residents with less money would get fewer resources. So in this sense, if you're off the map, it actually means quite serious things for resource allocation and for social equity. Which all reminds me of that great line, the map is not the territory, which I think is kind of really useful to return to think about the ways in which maps represent an idea of a territory, but they're always going to have their own perspectives and their own skews. And actually, the City of Boston, the Office of New Urban Mechanics is what it's called, they've done a really good job in thinking of how to offset that data. They're working with a set of researchers and scientists to say, how do we find other ways of understanding what's happening in the city when we start using signals like smartphone apps? But we have to ask some questions as we see more and more that our devices are becoming proxies for public needs, that we have to think about who is missing from those data sets and what happens if you're in the shadow of big data. This problem doesn't just go away as we see more people start to use smartphones either. And this is something that Matthew Zook, who's a fantastic critical geographer, has written about. That in actual fact, technology use is a constantly moving target as people are acquiring new different types of technologies, new different types of practices. It's always going to be a moving target. There isn't going to be this moment where everybody has the same technology, the same apps, and the same capacities. So in that sense, these kinds of questions aren't going to be going away anytime soon. But let me give you an opposite problem about visibility. So a lot of you would have read about predictive policing. It's being used in a range of different spaces in the US as a way both to try and address unsolved crimes, but also attempt to try and think about where crime might happen. So that the old adage of, pre-crime. Now, what's really interesting about the way that predictive policing works is it tries to generate hotspots, so areas where they can predict that a particular set of crimes are likely to occur again. And obviously there are some problems with this in terms of how we categorise certain groups and certain neighbourhoods as being essentially criminalised. And it also means that ultimately we're setting up very interesting kinds of inequities around surveillance. So what that might mean is, yes, there could be benefits and certainly cost benefits in predictive policing, but there are also some real problems. And this is a quote from a police chief who wrote this year, "The practical result of using these systems is a recipe for deteriorating relations between police and the community, a perceived lack of procedural justice, accusations of racial profiling, and a threat to police legitimacy." No surprise there. But the thing that I think is actually really interesting about this is this underlying tension between visibility and invisibility. The fact that in some cases, having visibility will allow you to use some excellent free systems, which will give you tools, which will give you particular kinds of social capital, and in some cases, even public resources. But there can also be these quite serious downsides around visibility in terms of the amount of agency that you might have over your data and how it might be used. So I think these factors are always in tension, the benefits and detriments of visibility in big data systems. And I think we have to talk about them together because they're ultimately twinned. They're the two sides of the same coin. And part of the problem right now about the debates around big data is that on one side you have people saying, big data is amazing, it's fantastic, it's going to change everything, it's the best thing ever. And then on the other side you have people saying, enormous threats to social equity, warning, warning, we have to do something about this. Rather than thinking about the fact that these things go hand in hand, and ultimately we have to think about them together. The problem with thinking about visibility and invisibility in these ways is that we also have to acknowledge that sometimes we're just not going to be the people who get to decide when we are seen and when we are unseen. So the fifth myth I want to talk about is the fact that big data is anonymous. And you've probably also seen this as a remarkable study that came out in Nature this year, which took 1.5 million mobile phone users in a European country over 15 months, took all of that data and tried to figure out how many data points, these are essentially spatio-temporal points where you are in a place at a particular time, to figure out how many you needed to identify somebody. Does anybody know how many it takes? 4. 4 points, and you can identify 95% of people, which is pretty extraordinary if you think about the fact that back in the 1930s, we discovered that in order to identify someone uniquely from a fingerprint, you need 12 data points. So with your cell phone data, we actually only need 4 to identify you as you. Now, that's pretty extraordinary. And the researchers were really fascinated by the way that they could try and make this data anonymized. And they said that it was very, very difficult. In fact, even with 2 randomized points, they could identify 50% of people. So this represents a totally different ballgame when it comes to how we anonymize data. And we already know from people like Alessandro Acquisti that you can very confidently predict someone's social security number simply by having their Facebook data and a couple of public sources of data. So big data's privacy problem actually goes far beyond these sorts of standard re-identification risks. I'm going to hit you very quickly with 2 other examples. Some of you will know about the smart grid. In fact, several Berkeley researchers are working on this at the moment. Basically what this does is it's trying to increase energy efficiency by tracking very closely how much energy you're using in your home at any one time. So if you have a look at this, you can see very clear spikes when you put the kettle on, when you run the washing machine, when you turn the lights off at night. It will be able to tell us when you have friends over, when you are sleeping. This is some very intimate data. And you could ask some interesting questions about how we're going to deal with this data, how we're going to use it, and what happens if data like this gets leaked. It's actually incredibly sensitive. The other thing where data is inherently sensitive is, of course, health data. Now, I always have to get this right. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, basically provides that you don't have to share your health information with a data provider. You have the option with a very small set of traditional health providers to opt out when you need to. But what is health information in the era of big data? Well, we basically know that every time you enter into a search engine a question about your physical or mental health, that information is being collected in ways that have absolutely no regulation whatsoever, but can still generate a very personal portrait of your current state of health. And in fact, this is currently being called health surrogate data. So it's not the kind of official data channels, but it's still incredibly powerful. And in fact, the legal scholar Nicholas Terry has written a terrific paper about this, where he says that essentially in the world of big data, HIPAA is basically like bringing a knife to a gunfight. And that he then argues that it's time for the federal government to put real limits on the collection and processing of personal information. So the final myth that I want to talk about today is that you can opt out. Yes, indeed. There is, of course, this emerging model that's starting to be talked about a lot, that you can opt out of big data if you're prepared to pay some serious cash. That is, if you start avoiding using free accounts that exploit your data and only sign up for paid services that can make profits without having to sell your data. We might have had this experience recently with Instagram, which attempted, after its sale to Facebook, to change its terms of service so that it ultimately could sell and monetize your photos and your location data to whoever it wanted, whenever it wanted. And obviously, a lot of people got very angry about this. Some of them left, but actually not so many. And the reason for that is because people essentially want to use these services. And there isn't even a paid option where you could say, I would like to pay not to have my photos on-sold to an advertiser. So Alexis Madrigal of The Atlantic, who is an excellent technology writer, decided to say, look, this is the time where we have to talk about the paid model, where you have to start saying, instead of this space where if you're not paying, you are the product, we have to be able to say, I will put money on the table to use this service and have some agency when it comes to my data. And you can certainly see the kind of logic here. And in fact, the other person who made this case recently is a Chief Justice who said, this is actually Alex Kaczynski, who said at a privacy conference that he would pay up to $2,400 a year for his family's privacy, which is not a small amount. And I think we can understand the impulse because it seems like a neat solution. Write a check, pay the money, have some control over your data. But obviously there are some real problems here because ultimately what happens if this becomes the norm? We can see a two-speed system emerging where those with money and privilege, the chief justices and the senior journalists, can effectively buy particular kinds of rights with their data, whereas a whole lot of other people are simply not going to be able to do this. This essentially turns privacy into a luxury good rather than a public good. And the reality is, even with this kind of paid opt-out model, what are the likelihoods that your data isn't still being used in particular ways and being analysed in particular ways? Well, very unlikely. Of course, that data is still valuable. So I think this is fundamentally what is wrong with notice and choice models that attempt to distill data privacy to being an individual decision. It's about these much wider social systems where we risk developing particular kinds of classes of the privacy rich and the privacy poor, or where those with particular kinds of technical literacy or money can effectively find a way out. So what do we do about this? Well, I think it's at conferences like this where we can actually raise these questions and have these conversations. Sadly, I can't give you a set of answers yet either because I don't think we know yet. But what I would do is I'd circle back to Levi-Strauss, who I mentioned at the start of my talk, who, after decades of fieldwork, decided that the great problem with the West was this fixation on the individual and the fact that the individual has perfect rational ability to make decisions all the time, and these decisions should be the basis of how we understand societies. Instead, he said that we needed to think about the way that societies work as collective entities, that they're making decisions that will ultimately determine the fate of that society. And I think with big data, we need to consider these wider ecologies of data, the way that data is essentially flowing between corporations, institutions, individuals, and communities. And we face considerable implications with big data sets, particularly in these tensions between visibility and invisibility. And I think the key issue is going to be how we navigate our way through those systems, not just individually, but collectively. And I think for researchers and for social scientists, it's another kind of reminder that as we look into these big data worlds, it's wise to cook and serve our data with care. Thank you.